Hello and welcome to this week's economics podcast for Economics A-Level. This week going to talk about living standards, how to measure it, how we get economic growth, a recap of the things we've done in the last couple of weeks. So recap first of all of how we get economic growth, which mainly we're looking at supply side policies. Remember, in your exam, you'll be rewarded, or examiners will take you more seriously. You'll get more marks if you're talking about policies that the government are currently enacting. So if you talk about education and training, you are not incorrect, but you need to remember there will be thousands of other students writing about that across the country. Examiners will see it lots and lots. And our current government, our funding per head in education, for example, is falling. So that's not what our government are doing. What they have done in the last few years, job seekers allowance, unemployment benefit has been frozen, which is a cut in real terms. That's an aim to get people back to work, to give them an incentive to cut the poverty or unemployment trap where you are better off on benefits than you are if you're in work. They have cut corporation tax, which is the tax on companies' profits, to 19%, which is the lowest in the G7. That is to give companies the incentive to invest and spend money, cause the accelerator effect. For workers, there has been an increase in the income tax allowance. So you now get up to £12,000 untaxed. Again, an incentive for people to go to work. With education, apprenticeships have been encouraged. So people train while they work, are better trained, increased productivity, hopefully. And then we've got transport projects such as HS2 with the aim to improve infrastructure and mobility of labour, so productivity again rises. The downsides of growth, very quickly, we looked at last time, but a quick recap. There's the potential for inequality to increase, so a worsening of the Gini coefficient shown on the Lorenz curve. There's, depending on the type of growth, is it short-term or long-term growth? Is it led by supply or demand? So if it's short-term growth due to increases in aggregate demand, you've got the potential downsides of demand pull inflation. You've got potential negative externalities. So if you think CO2 emissions, factories, greater transport, negative externalities might increase. And then you've got the potential worsening of the current account and the trade deficit. Remember, Britain has a high marginal propensity to import. So if we're growing, it's likely we're going to be spending some or quite a lot of our money on imports. In terms of the actual growth figure, so the nominal growth figure itself, we need to consider the starting point. So if you're evaluating it, if you're saying you've got economic growth of 5%, for developed countries like Britain, America, Germany, a growth figure of 5% is now going to be incredibly difficult to achieve because we're already developed, so we've already got a very high starting point. So you need to consider that starting point. Is the growth rate sustainable? So China, about 10 years ago, for a long period of time, was having double-digit growth. That was clearly unsustainable. Are we looking at the real figure? So are we looking at growth with inflation taken away? Is it per capita? So are we looking at a population increase as well? And then we need to consider things like the shadow economy, so the amount of illegal activity that's going on that might not be included, and the size of the informal economy. So if as a stay-at-home parent looking after their child, that's not included in the figures. But if you are paying a childminder to look after your children, then that would be included in the figure. There are other measures that don't just look at economic growth and don't just look at number factors. The OECD, which is the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, have the Better Life Index, where that looks at things like environment, education, housing, safety, community, work-life balance and health. So they would be included as well. To run through those quickly in terms of the UK. So environment, we're looking at things like negative externalities. So we'd be looking at green spaces, how much people exercise maybe. In terms of education, we're looking at the quality of education, how long people are in school for, maybe things like university coverage, how many people go to university. Obviously, in terms of the UK, we've got £9,250 per year fees, with higher interest rates now, 6%. In terms of housing, we'd be looking at the quality of housing, where the housing is located. So obviously we're in the United Kingdom quite weighed down by the southeast and the house prices. Housing in the UK doesn't rate very well on the Better Life Index due to the affordability or lack of at the moment. Safety, so you'd be looking at policing, levels of crime. Are you safe? Is it okay for business? Is it safe for businesses to do business? Community and sort of community engagement. So how trusting people are, maybe. Work-life balance. The UK has works the longest hours in Europe. So economic growth obviously could be gained if people work more hours, but is that actually good for the standard of living? And then health, obviously in the United Kingdom we have the NHS, which currently is free at the point of use, but you'd be looking at the quality of these services, perhaps waiting times, the so-called health postcode lottery. So are services better in some areas of the country than others? The Human Development Index, which is the United Nations measure of standard of living. Remember, it's measured between 0 and 1, with 1 being the best. So countries like Norway, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Australia, they're countries that are going to figure very well, and we're going to be about 0.9 on the scale. At the other end, the countries that could perform worst, most of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. So Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and countries in southern Africa. Those countries, HDI figures are affected by lots of civil war, lots of political corruption, and obviously that damages people's life chances. So the things that are used in the Human Development Index to measure the standard of living: the economic factor is gross national product per capita. So per capita just means shared out by head of the population. Gross national product is different to gross domestic product, that it includes investments and profits from businesses coming back abroad, but it's a very similar measure. In the health part of it, it looks at child or infant mortality, so that's the number of children that die before the age of 5, and your life expectancy. And with education, it looks at school enrolment, how many people start school, and the literacy rate. So in the UK, the literacy rate is pretty much 100%. Evaluating those figures or those factors, for GNP per capita, we need to look at the fact that that's just dividing the country's output via everyone in the country. Obviously, in the real world, that is not the case. There isn't a complete split equally of income. So if you think, or in any term of growth, so if you're looking at that on the Lorenz curve with the Gini coefficient, on your Gini coefficient number, remember, if you are at 1, that is complete inequality where one person would have everything. If you are at 0, that would be nearer to perfect equality where wealth or income was shared out completely equally. With health, life expectancy is an average, so not everyone is obviously going to live in the UK. I think it's females' life expectancy is 81, 82, males is about 78, but that's going to differ via area, that's going to differ via job, that's going to differ via income, so it's an average. And in terms of the education, school enrolment, it doesn't necessarily mean those children are finishing school, so they might start school, they might not finish. And it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the education. So they might all be in school, but it might not be for a set amount of hours, or the quality of that education isn't very good. The other thing to remember in terms of developing countries, or the other debate, is economic aid a help or a hindrance to these countries? So economic aid from countries, the UK has a set amount of its growth or its GDP per year that it gives in foreign aid to other countries. Do countries become over-reliant on this aid, so it means they don't develop themselves? Is this aid tied? So if the United Kingdom puts some money into a country or aid into a country, they might say, well, you have to buy these certain products, use these certain companies, which might help the UK. And are they over-reliant on it? So do they then not go and develop themselves because this aid is there? You've also got to look at the corruption. Is the money being spent well? Is it being corrupted? Would advice be better? So there's a debate between economic aid or advice. So should we just be advising these countries and helping them sort of stand on their own 2 feet? And lastly, wanted to recap on the a couple of phrases we've learned. The Easterlin paradox is a concept where once you get to a certain level of growth, that increases in economic growth don't necessarily make you happier. So Easterlin paradox is a good one to throw in for the high-end evaluation marks that, yes, as countries, we want economic growth, but once you get to a certain point, once you're developed like Britain, actually just economic growth isn't enough. So you might want to start thinking of those work-life balance things and trading off how much you work for leisure time, perhaps. And the last couple of terms wanted to recap on are demand and supply side shocks, or exogenous, which means outside of the economic system, endogenous meaning inside the economic system. Economic shocks are often asked about in exams. So if you have an exogenous demand side shock, that is something outside of the economic system that has an impact on the demand side of your economy. So it might be something that damages confidence or animal spirits, as Keynes called them, such as a terrorist attack or a natural disaster maybe. Or say if China had an economic shock, that would have an impact on our exports. An exogenous supply side shock, the go-to one is oil. So if there is an increase in oil price, that would affect your short-run aggregate supply curve, good or bad, depending on whether the price of oil is going up or down. So exogenous shock, even though it sounds bad, it could be a positive shock or a negative shock. So with supply side, I would go to oil. Okay, that is all for this week on living standards.